Hey, I'm Dan Potter, Creative Director at Creative Works. I'm going to take you through some of the insights on how we developed in collaboration with IMG and the people we work with at IMG, how we brought the set concepts to life. And I'm going to talk about, in this particular talk here, I'm going to talk about the power of the sketch and I'm going to run through and highlight how it enables an understanding of the vision, how it enables a conversation with your collaborators, and then enables a process for further thinking. As a designer, one of the things that I find really useful is if I'm in that situation where I'm tasked with this idea, this challenge of coming up with an idea, and I've got to think it through. The sketch process allows me to do that really important step, which is the thinking. So going through everything in a sketch may feel, and I had this for a long time, where I would feel a little bit like not exactly ashamed, but I would undervalue the sketch. Even though I'd seen everywhere around me that the best were doing, they're always starting with a sketch. So the best visionaries, best people that were coming up with the initial direction for something, cracking the visual code, so to speak, or the answer to the solution, they would always come up with a sketch. So I'm going to go through and talk you through a little bit of the process. And it really just started with this little bit of this little poke from Dickie when he sent me a WhatsApp around the Thursday, the 6th of February. So this is going back to the beginning of February. And it was just a very loaded question there, Dickie. How busy are you? And for a creative, that's a real you don't want to do that to a creative too often, because it will set them off, and they'll get obsessed with, what do you mean? How what's the opportunity? So anyway, he pinged me this, and we went and did a backwards and forwards, and ended up on a phone call where he told me that the project was for the eSports World Cup. I had to sign an NDA because it was a pretty significant project for IMG, who had decided they wanted to throw their hat in the ring for this eSports World Cup project, and needed some ideas contribute to that pitch that they were contributing to the request from eSports World Cup Foundation to provide some kind of broadcast coverage for the World Cup, which was going to be starting in July all the way through to August. So I don't know what no so tomorrow means, but it was probably not so tomorrow. So I basically got back to him. We ended up on a phone call, and I forced Dickie into just giving me a sense of what he was thinking in the form of a sketch. So I asked him to do me some sketches, but how do you go from that starting point to this at the end, where we're watching the finale of the broadcast in the form of these fireworks? It was a bit of a journey, but it all started with early conversations, trust, and then developing a plan and an idea around, starting very simply around the vision. So I had a conversation with him. He gave me a few ideas around that. It needed to feature the triangle, the equilateral triangle shape language. It was about the eSports World Cup. It was going to be in Boulevard City, Riyadh. And I forced him, as you can see here, to give me some sketches just so that I could. And I've had worse, Dickie. I've had worse, but this was a really useful little bit of information, because he was having conversations elsewhere, and I wasn't privy to those conversations, naturally, because of my proximity to the project. And he'd kind of got a lot of insight. So he gave me this rough idea of a sort of stage in Boulevard City, and you can see you got the buildings in there. I let him off because I could see where he's going, even though, he needed to get a bit more accurate here and here. But no, it was brilliant. So and then a funny story about this: I thought this was some kind of plinth, some kind of like upright plinth that we would use. Turns out on a coach ride back from Boulevard City back to the hotel during the week of setting up, that was Dickie's idea of the table. Anyway, he did eventually mention that it needed to have couches and sofas, but I went and then started working on a sketch. I laid down, this was my first sketch, just to get a sense of the idea of what we were playing with, tried to indicate where the people would be. It looked to me at the early stage that it would be no couches, although I think that the reason why there were no couches in Dickie's one, he had done couches, but he'd only done them as lines. And, you know, I did my best, Dickie. So anyway, I came back with this, and we had another backwards and forwards. He said, take away 2 of these. And I started to think about audio posts and, you know, working out a basic stage and playing with the layout, steps and ramps, 6 meter by 6 meter stage. That was where it originally started in terms of the footprint. And then we ended up going and adding a base to it. And at some point there was a thought that it'd be a 10-foot base, so that'd be really high up, which maybe that's next year. You know, indicating Riyadh Boulevard. And then what else did I put in here? Add rear rails. That was me sort of thinking there'll be some kind of like rear backing to give us a separation between the foreground and the background, or the midground and the background. So that was one of the first things. But this kind of goes back to this idea of, yeah, seeing the best. You know, Leonardo da Vinci with his sketches and his little notations. Now, you know, I'm no Leonardo da Vinci, but he was doing this many hundreds of years ago, over 500 years ago, probably, all the way through to someone like Frank Frazetta, who kind of was using sketches to get down his ideas, think about things in space, develop things, and then all the way through to another creator that I admire, in particular, Ridley Scott. These are the storyboards from Alien, but well, you can see it allows you to get what you're thinking in a kind of like in an imaginary sense out into the world, so that people can talk about them. So you can put it in front of people that aren't creative in the sense they're not bringing ideas to life in reality. They're part of that conversation, but they're not actually tasked with making sure it looks, works, and feels right for the event. And so when you're designing something, you having this artifact that you can at least throw out there, and I do this a lot with Guns N' Roses, where I'll share a sketch, just gives everybody a sense that it's either going in the right direction or it isn't at a very low cost and early stage. So sketches for me are almost the biggest single trick shot that you can use as a creator, just to say, look, this isn't my project, it's our project. Am I going in the right direction? So we ended up here, and we ended up developing all the screen content for this. But once I kind of got initial feedback and thoughts from Dickie, I'd done round 1 and then a round 2. Round 1 was the conversation. Round 2 was me responding. Then we started to develop the actual ideas. And that's where I then ended up going into the sketches. So these were my sketches. Once I'd kind of got a feel that I knew what was required, I came up with 3 ideas. The slope concept, which is the one that we actually went for in the end. We also had a step concept, because I was like, well, okay, so people can kind of like step up to the top level and come from the ground to the top. So that was a bit of a usable design approach. And then I had this E-Star concept, which for me was the favorite. But when we got into it, and it was a good thing that we did do this at the sketch level, was when we got into it and I started sharing the sketches around. And as I was doing the sketch, I actually thought, you know, are there any problems with the shape language? And my thoughts did go to the Middle East and, you know, like different cultures, and there are going to be problems with different cultures looking at this. And, you know, we're coming from the West, and when I do Western design, when I do a design, I'm definitely coming from a Western perspective. They are my biases. However, I do try to incorporate the biases coming from, say, the Middle East or the East, out in Japan or China or wherever. So that was something that was going on. But in my view, this was the World Cup. This was although it was in Riyadh, it was in Saudi Arabia. It was going to be in this special location. You still have to be sensitive to the location, but at the same time consider that it is for the world and it is for a subculture, and that subculture needed to feel like this set was futuristic and cutting edge. So these were the three approaches that I had, incorporating the feedback. And I think in the end, I did add a table in there. I think this one was where I put the eSports World Cup logo on the stage, and this one here I had it on the slope. In the end, the slope was a good decision because it allowed forced perspective. So where we eventually had to adjust the size of everything, I could still retain the original design, but just pull the front forward, which I had to do at a certain point where we were discussing footprint, how cameras were going to shoot, and, how much real estate we actually had in that boulevard. So that was the kind of initial work. And I also put together, we had these. I also put together a top view of my favorite one. I see there you go. I added a little table in there in the end, and the LED unit, which was actually originally Dickie's table. But anyway, we were introducing this live element to it. So we had these posts which had up beams potentially. So this was meant to be very well lit and very showtime, live event, live high energy music driven, game driven. And so the stage itself needed to be very entertainment based. Also did another view of it. So once I got the design, once I'd been playing around with shapes, and I played around with some shapes in 3D just to give me a sense of how the shapes sat at different eye lines, from the ground and then up from a drone. I then also added a room environment which had a kind of like came out a bit wider. We ended up flipping that round, but that became the frame for lighting and other elements, that we needed for the overall lighting of the stage, and including the air conditioning. We also talked about how we were going to have some kind of like Atmos in there and some kind of overhead truss, which at that stage I just put an indication in and handed that to the set builders who were going to interpret what we were creating and then bring it to life. So all in all, going through all of these elements, this was what we shared with the team early on. Once we'd done a round of work, overall these sketches took me around 2 days to pull together, including later on I did some reference work where I kind of went in. We did a table design later on, so this is a bit later on in the mix, but I came up with a table design, again inspired by the equilateral triangle, and then working in some of the shape language that the EWC had already had in their graphic elements. We'd also then taken the sketches and worked on patterning, surface materials, and then here is a little more of a kind of like a kind of indicative sketch that I did of the table to show how the materials and the feeling of the graphics needed to work in and around the table and how it was all going to come to life. This one also I considered a flared base, but in this one I kept it quite low key. And then these were the final rendered visuals that we got from modeling everything up and literally creating the couches with the way that the patterns were applied to get the set looking how we wanted the set to look. We gave them a couple of options on the table. This one was the one that was used, although at the time we didn't have the eSports Spotlight logo on it, and then that ended up having the eSports Spotlight logo when they realized what the name of the show was going to be, EWC Spotlight, but we did have an option early on. So coming back to the beginning, that's how we went from, "Hi mate, how busy are you?" to delivering the conceptual ideas for the set for the eSports World Cup.